The King Within, Accessing the King in the Male Psyche by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. Part 1. Hardwiring the Male Soul. Chapter 1. Gender Identity, Gender Asymmetry, and the Sexual Imbalance of Power. Increasingly today, men and women are struggling to live in a twilight world of gender confusion. Anxiously, they wonder what, if anything, constitutes their own unique sexual identity. Women don business suits and become bankers and lawyers. Men clean house and learn to change diapers. These shifts in traditional work roles may be all too good. But are there any real differences between men and women? If not, what joy is left us in sexual union? Have we become interchangeable parts, androgynous to the core? Some teach us to feel ashamed of our sex-specific differences. Supporters of radical androgyny go so far as to discourage research into the dissimilarities in brain structure or in the chemical, hormonal, or instinctual configurations that may influence some culturally exaggerated scripts. Some theorists offer stereotyped ideals of feminine psychological characteristics, now alone deemed fully human. Boys are said to be developmentally inferior to girls. Men are held to be biologically and emotionally inferior to women. Some radical feminists assert women would be better off without men entirely, or that male children should be genetically or socially engineered to eliminate masculine aggressiveness. This is not to say that all feminist criticism is invalid. The feminist critique of patriarchal societies make a great deal of sense. Patriarchy does tend to institutionalize a particular kind of masculinity, prone to exploiting and oppressing other human beings, their species, and the environment. But oppressive, macho societies deny men their mature masculinity as certainly as they degrade women and feminine attributes. Typically, a small minority of underdeveloped males at the top of the social pyramid will control power and wealth to the exclusion of all others, male and female. They rank these others in a descending order of usefulness to them, and defend against them with all the force of their inflated self-regard. Patriarchy is therefore a manifestation of the infantile grandiosity suffered by its leaders. Patriarchy is set up and run not for men as a gender or for a masculinity in its fullness or in its mature expression, but rather by men who are fundamentally immature. It is really the rule of boys, often cruel and abusive boys. For the most part, we believe human societies have always consisted of boys and girls more or less unconsciously acting out their immature, grandiose fantasies. Our planetary home, more often than not, has resembled the island world in William Golding's Lord of the Flies. Thus, our societies have, on the whole, opposed the realization and expression of both mature feminine and masculine psyches. Brutalized children, and foremost children in most times and places, brutality is a commonplace, but become brutal adults. But they are not really adults. They can only pretend to be adults while they still operate on a level of childish self-aggrandizement. The developmental crippling that generates a patriarchy is not, however, the sole responsibility of childish males. Immature males and females are unconscious partners in this socially sanctioned repression of children. A child's sense of self is distorted by a mother who fails to confront her own emotional needs and her own unresolved needs for power and adulation. The therapist, Alice Miller, has written a pioneering series of books that address poisonous pedagogy, as she calls this problem. Childish men and women never outgrow being self-interested and self-involved, and they pass their own wounds on to their children. Mature men and women find the ways to be selfless in their regard for others, even as they are manifestly self-caring. In sum, we feel it is wrong to view patriarchy as the expression of a mature masculinity or of masculinity in its essence. Patriarchal societies are out of balance partly because at their helm are unbalanced men. And while we abhor the often horrific abuses of patriarchal systems, We also remember that males helped generate, from earlier urban Neolithic cultures, all the higher civilizations we know from recorded history. The efforts of dynamic, self-engendering men have left an outstanding record of discovery and achievement. Clearly, the energies of men, in partnership with women and their feminine energies, have fueled, and will continue to fuel, the significant advances of imagination and social organization that characterize our species. Men of the past, in every tribe and nation, have struggled to learn how to use their power to bless the human community. We continue to struggle today. Defining masculine and feminine characteristics has led to much discussion. After years of research, depth psychologists and others argue that each sex carries both the psychological and physical traits of the other. No man is purely masculine, just as there is no purely feminine woman. Jungian psychologists call the feminine characteristics of the male psyche the anima. The female psyche's masculine characteristics they call animus. Both the animus and the anima develop in complex fashion as the personality grows to maturity. Neither men nor women can reach psychological maturity without integrating their respective contrasexual other. A man's female elements enhance his manhood, just as a woman's male aspects enhance her womanhood. Typically masculine characteristics are dominant in a man, as are feminine characteristics in a woman. Of course, there are exceptions, but this is usually the case. Central to all these discussions is the question of whether masculinity is in its essence more coercive, more abusive of power, more compulsively dominance-seeking than femininity. Many have implied or argued that biological gender differences necessitate rigid sex role differentiation and make masculine dominance inevitable. For example, the changing history of male and female roles within Israeli kibbutzim are presented as evidence of innate masculine and feminine characteristics. The kibbutzim were founded as farming communities in the late 19th century under the influence of Marxist ideals. Men and women were viewed not only as equal, but as inherently the same. In the fields, women worked the same long hours as the men. In the kitchens, nurseries, and children's dormitories, men worked the same long hours as the women. As the years passed, however, an unexpected development occurred. Slowly, the women left the fields, the traditional areas of men's work. More and more, they specialized in the work of the kitchens, nurseries, and dormitories. Gradually, the men specialized in the field work. Against the enormous pressure of the kibbutz ideology, most men and women sorted themselves into traditional, gender-specific roles. Was this the result of biology or immature manipulation of masculine power? According to sociobiology, primate ethology, and brain structure/hormonal research, there may be instinctual biological roots for such tendencies in social behavior. In addition, the anthropologist David Gilmour, in his Manhood in the Making, the first extensively documented cross-cultural examination of the cult of manhood, strongly indicates a widespread societal support for a division of social and work roles among men and women. Even if it could be proved, however, that some traditionally masculine or feminine tendencies may be inherited, this would not be a basis for justifying the usual caricatures of these traits. Above all, it does not justify the assumption that men are inherently violent, inordinately aggressive, insensitive, and uninterested in intimate relationships, nor that women have a monopoly on gentle, nurturing, emotional, and intuitive behaviors. Probably the most accurate argument is that men are more hardwired for psychological tendencies and women for others. Unfortunately, historical cultures nearly always have amplified rather than helped us compensate for these tendencies. Important as all these considerations may be, in this book, our purpose is not to focus on gender difference. We intend rather to advance understanding of the deep masculine and the challenge of stewarding masculine powers. For, whatever the source of masculine abuse of power, it is our responsibility as contemporary men to understand it and to develop the emotional and spiritual resources to end it. We want to help men express what psychoanalyst Erik Erikson termed the generative man within themselves. We will do this by exploring how masculinity is anchored in the place where body, instinct, mind, and soul arise in men. Contrary to those thinkers who, with Reinhold Niebuhr, regard power itself as inevitably leading to evil, we believe it is possible to steward power responsibly. The drive toward attaining personal and corporate empowerment is as much a part of our instinctual makeup as eating, sleeping, and procreating. We cannot wish away what psychologist Alfred Adler called the will to power, the desire to overcome. We shall overcome is not just a civil rights rallying cry. It is a human instinct to achieve efficacy and competence in adaptation. We cannot and should not raise our children to eschew this primal and ultimately life-enhancing instinct. The issue should never be how to get rid of the urge for power, masculine or feminine. The real issue is how to steward it and how to channel our other instincts along with it into life-giving and world-building activities. The problem of the modern attack on myth and ritual. The creative use of instinctual male energies, like the good use of any energy source, requires maturity. Human maturity has probably always been a rare commodity, but we believe it was, at least in some respects, more available in the past than it is today. It was more available in patriarchal states with all of their drawbacks than it is now in our modern societies. In the past, there were powerful rites of initiation presided over by ritual leaders to help boys and girls remake themselves into men and women capable of assuming their social responsibilities. The scope of these pre-modern initiation rituals was often limited by inflexible cultural norms, but they did provide boys and girls with workable blueprints for achieving gender-specific maturity and were based on mythic visions of the tribe's view of the best in human nature, their normative vision of the possible human. An apprentice electrician must be initiated by an experienced master into the mysteries of electricity's sources, methods of generation, and technologies of distribution. Whatever the apprentice does not take care to understand is a danger to him because electricity carries force enough to kill him. In similar fashion, all human beings need to be initiated into wise and self-enhancing uses of human psychological resources. Where misunderstood, the energies of our psyches can wreak havoc upon our lives. Despite the elaborate training our modern society provides an individual mastering a trade, we do not think to offer anything similar to the man who wishes to master his own psyche. But our lack of teachers doesn't change our need to learn how to access the powerful energies of our deep souls. Essentially, the process of initiation removes our ego from the center of the universe. When a society abandons initiation rituals, individual egos lose an appropriate means of learning their valuable lesson. Life circumstances will urge the same lesson upon the ego eventually, but perhaps in a very painful, inopportune manner. But by far the most serious consequence of ceasing initiation practices is the loss of a periodic social forum for considering the nature of maturity. A society has to know what maturity is before it can pass the knowledge on. It is as if we no longer have a map to get us to maturity. If you don't know where something is and you don't have a map, how do you get there? A few will stumble across this destination, but most of us end up getting hopelessly lost. When people bemoan our culture's loss of values, in part they are missing the old transformative rituals, for rituals provide a structure within which social values can be recalled and reconsidered. In many tribal societies, initiation ceremonies are still given the prominence they deserve. Through ritual training and the special imparting of carefully stewarded wisdom, the ego is displaced in an orbital position around a transpersonal other. The ego may experience the transpersonal other as any kind of group or task to which the individual pledges his or her loyalties, best efforts, even his or her life. In pre-modern societies, such group tasks and loyalties are always themselves ultimately subordinate to and given meaning by a greater transpersonal other, which religions of the world call God. As a complete cultural system, modernity has largely turned its back on God, on effective processes of initiation, on ritual elders, and even on family, tribe, and nation. Consequently, An individual ego can no longer reach the sober but joyous realization of its non-central position in the psyche and in the wider universe. Nature fills the vacuum modernity has created with our modern egos, which expand terrifically to fill the empty space. Where a powerful transpersonal other is missing, God is replaced by unconscious pretensions to godhood. An individual psyche, bloated by dangerously distorted assessments of self and others around it, family, friends, lovers, company, nation, and perhaps the entire globe, must pay the price for its infantilism. Corrupt politicians, money-hungry yuppies, drug dealers, wife and husband abusers, and new racists are but a few examples of infantilism. Run amok. Petty dictators, self-styled fundamentalists, messiahs, and their terrorist henchmen, Khmer rogue, genocide murderers, Chinese Communist Party bullies, international oil company executives, among many others, cause the social and environmental devastation that always accompanies the ego inflation of the human psyche unchecked by a sense of limits grounded in transpersonal other. These would be men and women have failed to grasp a sufficiently wide and deep vision of the archetypal realities upon which our psyche is founded. It is time we look again to these deep structures and draw from them the psychic support our modern era so desperately needs. 2. Decoding the male psyche. Carl Gustav Jung founded the school of analytical or depth psychology that provides the overall framework of our work. We rely heavily also on insights from theorists from other schools such as Sigmund Freud, Erik Erikson, D.W. Winnicott, Heinz Kohut, and Alice Miller. But we believe Jung's approach is the only one to provide a truly transcultural understanding of our human psyche. His is also the only approach to adequately bridge the gap between modern science and the mythological spiritual traditions of our species. Jungian depth psychology values the mysteries of the human soul. Dreams, visions, symbols, images, and cultural achievements arise from those mysterious depths that the world's religions understand as the spiritual dimension. Depth psychology embraces all human experiences as authentic to the psyche. Consequently, phenomena such as the soul, demonic possession, revelation, prayer, or God are completely compatible with scientific truth. Because all experiences are psychological, all are real, no matter how strange. Above all, any human experience is both based on and perceived by the deep psychological structures within us. Before we explore the deep structures of the male psyche, it will be helpful to define a few Jungian terms. Myth. For depth psychologists, myth does not imply a naive, untrue, pre-scientific tale about the origins of the world or humankind. Myths are true stories that describe the ways of the psyche and the means by which our psychological energies interact. Myths project our inner dynamics onto the outer world and allow us to experience it through a filter of how we think and feel. Since, in a real sense, we are the universe and the universe is us, myths often accurately describe the workings of the larger universe by using anthropomorphic images. That is to say, we are products of the universe in the same way that galaxies, oceans, and trees are. It would be a very strange thing indeed if our psyche did not mirror the structures found outside in the cosmos. An immediate and intimate correspondence between inner and outer is fundamental to our nature as beings. If no such link existed, we would be unable to acquire any realistic or workable knowledge of the world. We would be unable to survive. Ultimately, it is possible that inner and outer are purely subjective, pragmatic distinctions made by our consciousness in order to navigate within a mystery it cannot fully fathom. Creation myths illustrate this beautifully. In the Bible, the Hebrew God Yahweh creates the material world by speaking. He says, "Let there be such, and there is such and such." Behind this concept of creation stands the idea that naming something brings it into existence. Of course, modern science maintains the world did not come into being through a divine uttering of words or the naming of material objects. The biblical account does not convey a scientific truth about the world's origin. The truth it speaks is psychological. Human consciousness at its height is developed largely by the mastering of words, arising from language. At the same time, it gives rise to language. Consciousness creates our experience as it defines creation. The words we use for things allow us to distinguish this from that. They also profoundly color how we think and feel about those things. What we cannot name is therefore not really real or fully experienced for us. As far as our psyche is concerned, an unnamed thing is uncreated. Thus, the biblical image of Yahweh creating the world by naming it is true to human psychological processes. At the same time, if we assume there is an intelligence behind the created world, it might be true that that intelligence manifested the universe through some process analogous to the human use of language. If this were so, the biblical story would be working both as a psychological parable and as a visionary expression of a process that really is occurring. Ego. When Jungian psychoanalysts talk about the ego, they usually mean the I we normally think of as ourselves. The ego is who we believe ourselves to be, the part of our psyche we identify with our name. When we say, I feel this way about something, or I think I'll do that, the ego is probably speaking. Jungian theorists sometimes define the ego as a complex. By this, they mean a structural element of the total psyche that exhibits certain specific features. The ego operates in what we imagine to be our capacity to think rationally, in our feelings, in our ability to will actions, remember the past, and create the future, and in our encounter with consciousness. In reality, however, the question of the ego is more complicated. Often I am not the one who is thinking, feeling, acting, willing, or deciding. Rather, some autonomous complex other than the ego may temporarily possess it and make it operate out of the complex's perspective. Since the ego is largely unaware of these other complexes, it is tricked into the illusory feeling of holding a solitary place in the psyche and into an accompanying illusion of its free will. According to Jung, the other complexes operate largely from the personal unconscious, but may also be anchored in a transpersonal unconscious, which exerts a deeper influence on the psyche. Consciousness. Consciousness is not confined to the ego. The subconscious or unconscious is itself conscious. It is only unconscious, invisible, and indistinct from the ego's perspective. Personal complexes other than the ego and the deeper transpersonal psychological structures of the unconscious can be conscious of each other and of the ego, and they operate out of their own agendas. The case of multiple personality disorder demonstrates this clearly. Here, highly activated complexes usurp the place of the ego in the daily affairs of the afflicted person, causing him or her to behave in ways the ego neither wishes nor sometimes even remembers afterward. What is true for people who suffer multiple personality disorder is true, though to a lesser extent, for all of us. We all at times act in ways contrary to how our ego wills us to behave, perhaps through deep mood swings and emotionally violent outbursts of fear and rage. When we return to a state of ego consciousness, we say things as I went out of my head, or I don't know what came over me. What came over us, like a wave of energy that shifted our whole mode of perceiving, feeling, and acting, was an autonomous complex, another consciousness from within the total psychic system that is ourself. Autonomous complexes are usually, though not always, organized around traumatic childhood experiences. During early traumas, our emerging ego split off and repressed aspects of that psyche that parents, siblings, or society found unacceptable. These split-off aspects could be thoughts, feelings, images, or associations. Often they are valuable and worth recall. They may carry hidden talents, intuitions, abilities, or accurate feelings that would make our personalities wiser and more complete if we could integrate them. Until reintegration can occur, our psyches are like the pieces of a broken mirror, which hold in fragments that was once a complete reflection. Through all our complexes, including the ego and the vast territory of the unconscious, consciousness pervades our psyche. Archetypes. Archetypes operate at a level of the psyche deeper than that of the personal unconscious with its autonomous complexes. They are hardwired components of a genetically transmuted psychic machine. They are the bedrock structures that define the human psyche's own nature and make it the same, regardless of the culture in which an individual lives. In this sense, archetypes represent transpersonal human psychological characteristics. They are dynamic, energetic elements in all of us. They well up and fall deep within our unconscious like tidal pools. Our daily life is influenced by these energies in ways we can never fully understand. Jung declared that the archetypes are equivalent to the instincts of other animals. He located them in what he called the collective unconscious. The existence of an unconscious, or what many called the subconscious, had been noted for some time, but Freud was the first to make it the focus of major psychological investigation. Before him, even where psychologists acknowledge the subconscious mind's existence, they usually dismissed it as an inert repository of forgotten or repressed experiences. Freud's interest in the mind's possibilities had been aroused during his medical studies with the great Parisian hypnotist, Jean-Martin Charot. Charot dismissed the results by his own experimental demonstrations as stemming from patient hysteria. Whatever their source, the hypnotic manifestations witnessed by the young Freud convinced him he'd found a rich field for further study. Common to all of us, Freud's life work implied was the subconscious deeper than a particular personal one. He called this instinctually based subconscious the id, the Latin word for it. This wild, primitive id was responsible for all kinds of enormously powerful and irrational impulses, especially aggressive sexuality. Classic Freudians have tended to regard the subconscious as more or less unstructured, but a number of neo-Freudians maintain that the deep psyche, far from being chaotic, is characterized by structure. Erik Erikson talks about instinctive structures and performed action patterns which, under appropriate circumstances, call up drive energy for instantaneous, vigorous, and skillful release. He proposes the existence of a general psychic energy, instinctual force, which can be put to use by a variety of performed and relatively autonomous instinctive patterns. He also says the action patterns, the modes and modalities are all present in the ground plan from the beginning, yet they have their special time of ascending. His thoughts come remarkably close to the Jungian conception of time and circumstance release archetypal action patterns from the collective unconscious. Jung pushed the exploration of the collective unconscious structures a step further. Stored within them, he claimed, are both the human psyche's archetypal building blocks and the accumulated collective memory of the entire human race. He reached this conclusion because he discovered that symbols, images, myths, and gods from different cultures and epochs bore striking resemblances to one another and also to the images that appeared in his patients' dreams. According to his conception, the collective unconscious is the source and the limitless reservoir of all the images recorded in human art, mythology, and religion. From it leap both the poet's song and the scientist's insight. From it flow the signal dreams which have the implication often an entire society as much as for their dreamer. The psyche's archetypal structures serve as conduits for the great charges of primal psychological energy. Because of their own dynamic configuration, they mold this energy, imparting it their particular patterns. Psychologists call this life force in psychic form the libido. Freud believed it is fundamentally sexual, and any expression of the libido redirected into pursuits other than sexual ones he called sublimations. Jung, on the other hand, believed that the libido is a generalized life force that expresses itself through imaginal and spiritual impulses as well as through sexuality. For any individual, the archetypes may be creative and life-enhancing or destructive and death-dealing. The result depends in part on how the ego is able to relate to them based on its own developmental history. Properly accessing and using the libido available to the psyche amount to a sort of psychological technology. If we learn the technology and use it properly, we can use the energy to make generative men and women of ourselves. But if we fail to learn how to use these vast energy resources or misuse them, we will be courting our own destruction, and we may take others with us. If we try to ignore the archetypes, they exert their mighty influence upon us nonetheless. They bend us to their non-human, sometimes inhuman wills. We must therefore face the evidence step psychology and other studies have provided us. We are not as free of instinct or unconscious content as we have been encouraged to believe. Genuine freedom for the ego results from acknowledging and properly accessing the chemical fires that burn hot in our unconscious minds. Some Jungian analysts romanticize the archetypes. They encourage their patients to find and claim the particular archetype or myth that has organized their lives. Life then becomes a process of affirming and living out this myth. In our opinion, our goal should not to identify with archetypal pattern or to allow a mythic expression of it to make our lives what it will. We believe that when we romantically identify with any archetype, we cease to be viable human beings moving toward wholeness. If we are drawn to an archetype by its seductive power, its promise that we can shirk our individual responsibilities, and the pain involved in being a person with a personal ego, we will be crushed by the sheer weight of unconscious compulsive impulses. On the other hand, our goal is not to become ordinary in our quest for psychic health. We must not lose the vital connection with the libidinal energy the archetypes supply us so that we can live our lives fully, energetically, and creatively. Our goal is to learn how to differentiate ourselves from the archetypes without completely disassociating ourselves from them. If we learn to access them successfully, they become resources of energy both for our personal lives and for healing our planet. We become more radiant in every area of our lives. More precisely stated, our objective is to develop mature ego structures strong enough to channel useful libidinal energy into our daily lives. We can begin by making ourselves conscious of how archetypal energies already possess us. Only then can we begin to access them creatively, through a process that provides us with a greater sense of free will in the choices of our lives. The effort to achieve liberation for ourselves will in turn motivate us to help others do the same. Our renewed energies benefit ourselves and others on all the levels of our psychic organization, the personal, the familial, the communal, national, and global. Shadow. Jung himself occasionally identified the shadow with the totality of the unconscious, but most depth psychologists view the shadow as an individual, multifaceted contra-ego of the same sex as the ego. If the ego is a photograph, the shadow is its negative, standing in direct opposition to the ego. The shadow is an autonomous complex, which holds opinions, expresses feelings, and generally wills an agenda radically different from the ego's. Like most autonomous complexes, the shadow results from childhood trauma. Those qualities of a person's total psyche that are diametrically opposed to the emergent ego and which the ego rejects because of the pressures of the childhood environment coalesces in the unconscious. There they form a distinct, conscious, willing entity. Unless reintegrated later in life, they forever seek to sabotage the ego's plans and behaviors. We have all had the experience of willing one scenario and living quite another. For example, we intend to remain friendly while visiting our in-laws, but then find ourselves drawn irresistibly into arguments and confrontation. Our egos want to maintain an image of family harmony. Our shadows, unable to tolerate such hypocrisy and feeling real animosity toward our in-laws, compel us to behave in a more honest, if more destructive way. The animosity we feel is ultimately toward ourselves, but it often takes a lot of work before we realize this. The shadow endorses this work because it longs for reintegration. It is the shadow's method to lead us into holding our impossibly defensive, illogical positions in order to confront us with whatever psychic complexes we would rather forget. Our real-world hatreds are most usually against these inner complexes, and our shadow works by repetition compulsion to call our attention to them. Rather than face any rejected qualities, either positive or negative, within ourselves, we frequently deal with our shadow by projecting these qualities onto others. As an ego, we don't project them, but our shadow does so in order to focus our interest on its feelings, wishes, and agendas. Our shadow induces us to see other people we disapprove of or dislike the colors that are perhaps only marginally like their true colors, but which are colors that the shadow itself possesses. Jung believed withdrawing a projection of the shadow and owning it as part of ourselves requires enormous moral courage. He also believed what we will not face within our psyche will be forced to confront in the outer world. So, if we can claim our shadow's qualities and learn from them, we diffuse much of the personal conflict we would otherwise encounter. People who have served as the screens for our shadow's projections become less odious and more human. At the same time, we experience ourselves as richer, more complex, and more powerful individuals. The triangular structure of the archetypes. In this book, our definition of the shadow includes the traditional Jungian understanding, but introduces another archetypal, transpersonal aspect to it as well. We believe masculine and feminine archetypes possess their own shadows. The king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover are the masculine archetypal structures we have undertaken to study in this series. In one sense, these archetypes are operating at a more primitive level than the ego accessing them, and each has its own shadow. In our extended definition, a shadow always manifests where there is an immature, fragmentary psyche, because splitting is always a symptom of unintegrated development. In the traditional Jungian view of maturity, wholeness is achieved to the degree that the split between the ego and the shadow is overcome. In other words, psychological maturity is a measure of how thoroughly the ego is able to integrate the shadow into its consciousness. We maintain that the ego's shadow split represents the shadow itself in itself. The split actually involves the ego in the bipolar shadow of one or more archetypes. In this situation, our ego usually identifies with one pole of the archetypal shadow and disassociates from the other. In our view, then, the shadow can still be regarded in the traditional way as the psychic area from which the ego is divided, but more fully as a bipolar system characterized by splitting, repression, and projection within the energy field of an archetype. For a long time, psychologists associated bipolar disorder almost exclusively with the manic-depressive personality. Then, in his modern psychopathology, Theodore Milan extended the idea of bipolarity to include passive and active dimensions in all the major disorders of personality. In a similar fashion, some Jungians have described a bipolar relationship between certain archetypes, though they are not in themselves personality disorders. That gave rise to such archetypal pairs as the senex puer, old man, eternal boy, and the domina puella, old woman, eternal girl, and others. In the case of the warrior archetype, for example, neither the sadist nor the masochist, the two poles of the warrior shadow, represents personal growth or fulfillment. The full embodiment of the warrior is to be found in a third transcending option that integrates the two poles into a creative psychological structure. Soon they define psychic wholeness. Archetypes are always reconciling opposing forces in this way. Both of the opposing poles in the archetypal shadow systems contain qualities essential for psychological health. But if left in their state of chronic tension, they will condemn the ego to a fragmented and immature existence. Guided by the archetypes in their transcending fullness, a mature personality integrates these important qualities by reconciling the divisions in the archetypal shadow. Our refined understanding of how the archetypes work suggests interesting analogies with other schools of thought. The psychologist Alfred Adler, a contemporary of Freud and Jung, believed personality disorders appear both in active and passive modes in a way similar to our view of how archetypal shadow systems work. The Christian theologian Paul Tillich grounded his thought with a belief in what he called the ambiguities of space and time in the created world. He believed that these ambiguities find their resolution in a third, higher reality above history. The impulse to achieve this comes from the spirit. The German philosopher Hegel saw the forward movement of the universe as occurring through a thesis, antithesis, synthesis process in which each synthesis became a new thesis, and so on in a continual upward program of evolutionary complexity and integration. Alfred North Whitehead, the great 20th century American philosopher, sees the whole adventure of ideas that create the world, as a process by which God lures the created world forward in tiny increments, which he calls occasions. These occasions are like Hegel's thesis, and God is the ever-changing antithesis. Whitehead calls this unceasing process creative advance. Similarly, Jung drew from his alchemical studies the idea of the conjunctio oppositorum, union of opposites, impelled by a transcendent function, the conceptual equivalent to Tillich's spirit and Whitehead's lure. Jung believed it essential for the ego to balance opposing images, feelings, and points of view without allowing either of their opposed sides to disappear into the unconscious. Eventually, when the struggle is consciously experienced with all the suffering it demands, our psyche can follow a transcendent third possibility to greater wholeness. Jung's followers have largely neglected the ego's vital role in determining how the archetypes will shape our everyday lives. With our model of the triangular structure of the archetypes, an individual can take care to see that the archetypes will manifest in their fullest form rather than in their shadow structures. An ego that does not properly access an archetype will be possessed by the archetype shadow and left oscillating between the shadow's two poles. At one, the ego will suffer the positive inflation, explosion, and at the other, negative inflation, implosion. Separated, the shadow's two poles express the pathological darkness which is only enlightened by a polar integration into the transcendent third of the archetype. Their pathology is transformed by the ego into a creative advance. The action of the ego is the key to this transformative experience. The ego and the elements of the archetype exercise a kind of gravitational pull on each other. To allow transformation, the ego must position itself above time and space in the domain of the spirit or the collective unconscious. The ego will serve ultimately as an occasion for the archetype's expression in time and space. Unless the ego can work above the spatio-temporal dimension, the archetype will appear largely in its fragmented polar aspects, and the ego will attract these to itself. In the spirit's domain, the ego can instead keep its proper fix on the lodestar the archetype's transcendent third represents. The archetype's bipolar arrangement in time and space is portrayed in the mythic image of the Symplegade goddess. The clashing rocks the ego must pass between in pursuit of the archetype's transcendent third. The ego needs to be lured by this full expression of the archetype to experience creative advance on its own and in the world. And the archetype needs the ego in order to experience itself in space and time and to recover its lost shadow fragments. The act of recovery empowers the archetype's ongoing creative action in the world. According to our theory, there are 4 foundational archetypes of the mature masculine, as well as of the immature masculine. Each of these triangles, king, warrior, magician, and lover, since they are interdependent aspects of the single masculine self, fit together in a pyramidal form. The pyramid, as it has appeared throughout the ages, can be interpreted as a symbol for the masculine self. Pyramids from Egypt to Mesoamerica, from Mesopotamia to Hawaii, are representations of the universe in miniature and often display a layered or stepped form. The layers of the pyramid nearly always stand for the layers of the universe, the different cosmic levels of reality. By ascending the pyramid, an individual climbs from the profane dimension to the sacred, from the less divine to the fullest manifestation of divinity. This idea parallels ours about the upward direction of the ego's individuation from a less integrated, profane state to a fully integrated, sacred or divine state. A man's ego must ascend the 4 faces of the step pyramid of the masculine self, thereby overcoming the bipolar shadow split at the base of each of the faces. The ego must keep its eye on the capstone of the pyramid, which represents the fullest expression in an individual of the 4 archetypes in perfect unity. This ascent of ego consciousness, according to Jung, is always a matter of the reconciling opposites and of integrating split psychic materials. As a man's ego ascends through each of the triangular structures of the archetypes, he becomes more integrated and whole, and he is better and better able to access the archetypes in their fullness at the top of the pyramid. On the king's side, he integrates the tyrant and the weakling. On the warrior face, he integrates the sadist and the masochist. On the magician surface, he integrates the detached manipulator and the denying innocent one. And on the lover side, he integrates the addicted lover with the impotent lover. Each of the poles of the split shadows of the 4 major archetypes possesses insights and strengths that, when the ego integrates them, contributes to a consolidated sense of self. Each of the bipolar opposites, when united, reveal the transcendent third of the archetype in its fullness. By overcoming the splitness in the bipolar archetypal shadows, a man comes to feel inwardly empowered, and, in a sense, while he is building internal masculine structure, he is also discovering the pyramid of the masculine self, which has always been within him, at his core. The archetypes in brain structure. Startling resonances are being discovered between the fields of brain research and depth psychology. In his book, Archetypes: A Natural History of the Self, the psychologist Anthony Stevens has extended the exploration of areas of the brain that may be the loci of archetypal forms. He tries to explain Jung's theory of personality types in terms of brain structures. Jung's intuitive types, he speculates, might be using predominantly their right brains, and those who favor their left brains would correspond to Jung's thinking types. Briefly, the right brain, the right hemisphere of the cerebral cortex, thinks in images and symbols, grasps situations and patterns as wholes, and is the primary center of the generation of dreams, visions, and fantasies. The left brain, the corresponding left hemisphere, thinks sequentially, analyzes situations and patterns logically, and uses language in its cognitive processes. Many locate the ego entirely in the left brain. In contrast, Stevens proposes that while the ego may function most of the time in the left brain, it also draws on the right brain. Consciousness, he says, is a pervasive function of the whole brain, though right and left brain modes of consciousness are quite distinct. The personal unconscious and its various complexes seem to manifest in the right brain. By dreaming, the right brain communicates with the still primarily left brain identified ego. Rather than locating the archetypes in the right brain, Stephen proposes that they arise in deeper, older layers of the brain, layers that, according to brain researcher Paul MacLean, have remained largely unchanged for millions of years of animal evolution. This dihemispheric cerebral cortex we think of as the human brain is only the most recently evolved element of the three distinct neurological regions. Before it, in ascending order of antiquity, come the neocortex, or the neomammalian brain, apparently responsible for cognition and sophisticated perception, the midbrain, or the paleomammalian brain limbic system, which seems to generate the basic emotions of fear and anger, affiliation and maternity, as well as species-characteristic individual and social behaviors, and the upward growth of the spinal cord, the reptilian brain, or complex responsible for basic life activities, also probably the seat of our most basic instincts and our routine-driven behaviors. These three brains within a brain function relatively autonomously. Our process of psychological integration is, in part, an attempt to unify and synchronize these three regions of the brain. If archetypes arise, as Jung believed, at a fundamentally instinctual level, then it could be that they originate in our most primitive region, the reptilian brain, elaborated as they pass upward through the paleomammalian and the neomammalian brains. The imagistic, intuitive structures of the archetypes would arise primarily into our right brains. But since our ego's experience of the archetypes will also mediated via the left brain, they will also be influenced by the linguistic and logical modes of thinking centered there. Archetypes hold a sense of otherness. Perhaps they originate in levels of the brain so much deeper than the source of ego consciousness, and then must be translated into terms that make sense to the left brain. Archetypes in their fullness involve both left and right brain functions. This is clearly the case with the four foundational archetypes of the mature masculine, which we are outlining in this series. Certainly the rational, strategic, and emotionally detached modes of the magician and the warrior are characteristic of left brain processes. Also, they seem to draw secondarily on right brain functions, and the visually oriented, aesthetic, intuitive modes of the lover are characteristic of right brain functions, although the lover seems to draw on left brain processes. We attempt a more thorough discussion of the origin of the four archetypes of mature masculinity and the brain's limbic system, paleomammalian brain, in Appendix B. This field of inquiry is wide open to exciting future research. Convergence of mature masculine archetypes. Depth psychologists often merge the mature masculine archetypes, because only the most perfectly realized ego apprehends an archetype's full expression. For most of us, they retain a degree of mystery. The very images and symbols archetypes are used to communicate to us refer beyond themselves to other images and symbols in an almost infinitely complex way. For example, the phallus, the cross, the tree, the axis mundi, the spine, the sacred mountain, and the pyramid can each be read symbolically as aspects of one another. There are dangers, however, involved with the overinterpretations. An individual can easily lose himself, as Yeats, who As Yeats was warned in the course of his occult researches along the path of the chameleon, a labyrinthine trail of correspondence. Besides this, the four basic archetypes that influence the mature man, the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover, are the fragments of a primevally whole self, and complement each other to such a degree that no one of them receives its fullest expression without incorporating the others. These archetypes have historically merged and diverged again in a bewildering variety of configurations. Rain magicians, for example, give rise to rain kings, who appoint priests to elect warrior kings, who commission other warriors to serve magicians who themselves become kings. A mortal king, to the extent that he fully expresses the archetypal king, is a warrior who enforces order within his kingdom and who may take military action to extend his kingdom. He is also a sacred king, a high priest who mediates between the spiritual dimension and his people. He is also a lover of his people, and in a special sense of his sacred queen, since he cannot rule legitimately or effectively unless there is a union which is fruitful. Despite these uncertain boundaries, it is useful to distinguish masculine archetypes in order to enhance the ego's capacity to access these psychic structures in all their richness and complexity. The alpha male, a primate prefiguration of the sacred king. Chimpanzees are our closest living relatives. Their genetic profile is over 98% identical to ours. Primate ethology research suggests close correspondence between their social structures and interpersonal behaviors than ours. It seems likely that similar psychological processes are at work. While, of course, we cannot know fully what other animals feel and think, in many ways we cannot be sure we know what other human feels or thinks. In either case, we make judgments based on observable behaviors. Our great advantage in observing humans, obviously, is spoken language, but we still have the subjective task of interpreting linguistic signs. Chimpanzees, while they cannot speak, can communicate with us in sign language and through other quasi-verbal methods designed by researchers. In addition, their complex range of body signals bears a striking resemblance to our own body language. It seems reasonably safe to assume that when chimpanzees appear to be fearful, wrathful, submissive, loving, or odd, they are in fact experiencing these emotions. Probably their emotional experience is less self-conscious and complicated than ours, but it still offers clues into primate psychology, including our own. The hierarchical power blocks and coalitions of chimpanzee society center around a dominant adult male ethologist called the alpha male. Successful alpha males are usually mature and physically powerful. They display foresight, courage, and what can only be called character. Alpha males exhibit many behaviors common to the sacred king. The specific archetypally inspired figure we'll be exploring in the pages to come. Alpha males surrender themselves with male knights to help support their claim to power in their realms. These males exhibit characteristics of what David Gilmour calls the cult of manhood in human males. Like their human counterparts, chimpanzee males are protectors and providers for the females and the young of their societies. The alpha male is our first look, long before the curtain of human history rises, at the Lord of the Four Quarters, a title ancient Mesopotamian kings used to describe their central position in what was, for them, a quadrated cosmos. We believe the alpha males among chimpanzees, gorillas, and other primates are working out of archetypal structures similar to those of their human counterparts, albeit on a much more primitive level. They impose order on the frequent chaotic outbreaks in their realms. They settle disputes at their best, seem to inspire admiration and respect in their subjects. In return, they defend their subjects with great ferocity, and at times pay for their efforts with their lives. Decisions over when to make the tribe to different feeding grounds, for example, seem largely to be theirs. Alpha males enjoy the trappings of authority and wealth, often in terms of desirable females, for example, but often behave generously, even altruistically. We can see in the alpha male the primordial energetic structures of the masculine self. Human males experience the self in a significantly more elaborate form. In one sense, the gap between the alpha male and the sacred kings of human history is an enormous one, millions of years long. In another sense, however, the gap is incremental. If Stevens and others are right in their analysis of human brain structure, there is an alpha male within us. We offer this book and the series as a whole to the man who is looking for an operator's manual to the psyche, and to the woman who wants a guide to the hard wiring of men, and to her own inner masculine as well. Just as no jet pilot would try to fly a 747 without knowing its capabilities and instruments inside and out, the only way to fly successfully an immensely complicated male psyche is to know it inside and out, with a clear understanding of how to access its archetypal energy systems. The mindful use of this energy will bring a man safely into his mature manhood.